You're listening to the Whole Church Podcast, a proud member of the Anazal Podcast Network. Our efforts to educate and unite the church are made possible thanks to our sponsors on Apple Podcast, Captivate, and Patreon. If you would like to join them and help sponsor our show, please consider doing so on one of those networks or by leaving a one-time tip on Captivate using the link that's in the show's description.
James 1:5-8 in the Christian Standard Bible say, "Now if any of you lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives to all generously and ungrudgingly, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith without doubting, for the doubter is like the surging sea, driven and tossed by the wind. That person should not expect to receive anything from the Lord, being double-minded and unstable in all his ways." Here, James is in the middle of writing about trials everyone must face in life. He writes that we need to turn to God for wisdom in our trials, and that our trials will build our faith. After the verse, James even warns the reader not to attribute any temptations they face to God. This verse seems to condemn having doubts in our struggles. Do you think the author's intent here is to tell the readers to continue on to what's next without any doubts?
Yeah, it seems to definitely be a call to a pretty, what we would call extreme form of faith. Definitely, it's not easy to just say, "Hey, just don't doubt." Can you just not do that? It's difficult to do that. Nobody's saying it's easy, but it seems like to really call on God and ask for miracles, you gotta put that best faith foot forward. You can't have those doubts that cause you to second guess. You can't have those backup plans and other allegiances when you're coming to God.
Yeah, nice. All right, what is up, Whole Church? I am TJ, your co-host with the co-most. Josh has been abducted. We paid his ransom, so he's on his way back. He'll be back soon. But we did have to pay that ransom, so donate Patreon. We're here today with Jake Doberenz. We're going to talk about what's next. This is for our What's Next series. We're here to talk about what's next after divorce with Mr. Jake Doberenz. And here is Joshua Noel, back from his abduction.
Fun.
Yeah. So, you should really check out the Anazal Ministries Podcast Network website. The link is below for shows like ours. And if you're listening on the YouTube channel, hit subscribe. If not, go to YouTube and click a different video and hit like and subscribe.
I don't know why. I just did not think that was not going to be the repercussions. I didn't think you were going to be like, if not, do this other thing. I just thought you were about to threaten them.
No, I don't do that.
Why not?
Don't feel like it.
I suppose that's fair. So, with that, you guys know one of my favorite forms of silliness. Unity is silliness. Sorry, I am scatterbrained today, guys, which is perfect to set up. I've already answered this. You're waiting for TJ's answer to this. We all, in this series, are finishing a silly story. The same silly story. So, Jake, I hope that you're excited to be part of the world's greatest anthology that isn't the Bible, of short stories.
Absolutely.
Great. So, the silly story for this, I'm going to start it. You got to finish it. Them the rules. Once upon a time, TJ was playing ping pong against a sea turtle on board a steam engine train when he
took such a large swing that he fell through the steam engine train boxcar and fell into a lion cage that was on board.
That's right. That is what happened.
That's actually how that chapter of Daniel started. It's the prelude.
Yeah, they cut this out.
Yes, and definitely not the beginning of an Indiana Jones that I was riffing off of. But anyway,
Yeah, this is actually in the Pseudepigraphica. You want to go pick that up.
Good vocab word, yeah.
Fantastic, yeah, great stuff. Oh man. So first thing, Jake, we wanted to ask you just to kind of get to the punch of it. You have a history with marriage and with divorce and stuff we want to talk about. It's hard to follow up the silly story with this. I know it's very sombering and it is a very serious topic. Yeah. So we don't want to demean it. And I don't want to just be like, oh, so you had this. Let's talk about it. So I'm not really sure how to build into this. Could you just break down what is your history with marriage, divorce, and how all of that's impacted your ministry?
Yeah, Joshua will give you the crown of the king of segues. That was excellent. Good job.
I try.
Just sort of but before I kind of begin in the story, I do definitely want to say that this is going to be my version of events, and it is accurate from my perspective. But of course, it takes two to tango, and there's somebody else involved here.
Yeah.
And so I do want to just off the bat respect that and say that, again, I'm going to try to be honest and kind from my perspective, but, there could be other views here. Having said that, I got married 2 weeks after I graduated college. The classic Christian college sort of environment leads you to often get married pretty young, pretty quick. This girl and I started dating just at the end of freshman year of college. So most of my college experience was with her, and then we got hitched, and then we got married. Right after I ended my undergrad education, right before I started grad school. And so I'm just 27 years old, and most of my 20s have been spent in a relationship with this woman, and we were married for about 4 years when things started to get kind of rocky. And the difficult thing for anybody that has been married any kind of length of time is it can kind of be difficult to, mind read. Apparently, it's just a lot easier when you kind of tell the other person what's going on. But what's tough is oftentimes we can't always describe what's going on. And both of us on our own end felt a tension kind of happening. There was something wrong, but we couldn't pinpoint it exactly. And it was probably about 6, 7, 8 months from my perspective of where it's like something's kind of off here. The honeymoon phase is over. Things are becoming a little more tough. Little things are turning into arguments. There isn't quite that same romance and affection, and things were tense, were difficult. But from my perspective, it was still like, this is marriage. Everybody told me this was going to happen. You spend a couple years in bliss, and then real world hits. For most people, that doesn't necessarily have to be something that happens where you have to have marital struggles, or else you're not, whatever. And so at this time, it was toward the end. It was actually a couple weeks after my birthday, where one day she didn't want to sleep in the same bed as me, and that was kind of a red flag. Okay, well, something's a little more serious here. Something's going on. And it led us to go to marriage counseling. And we were separated for a time during that. And I was hearing from her a lot of her struggles and perspectives, some things she didn't like about what was going on. And about 6 weeks into marriage counseling, which is about 6 weeks of both of us sort of saying, here's what went wrong. Here's what we don't like. The counselor asked, okay, so what now? We've had our 6 weeks of kind of diagnosing the issues, talking about the problems. Where do we go from here? Because it takes two to save a marriage. And she decided at that time that she did not want to save the marriage. That was not her priority. She was not interested. And so that was not fun, and that was not what I wanted to hear. And it took about a year until the divorce papers were officially signed after that, where I was still trying to save the marriage in my own way. I read probably 30 books on marriage and relationships. I went to a workshop. I even hired some coaches. I even anonymously appeared on one marriage radio show, and I was trying to figure this out. I was really trying to save it. And ultimately, that is not what came to pass. And here I am now. We are about 2 years out from the first start of the problems, of the drama, of the spiral, and then about a year out from the actual divorce papers being signed. And so now I'm here on the show to tell you about life after divorce. So how was that for a
Yeah. No, thank you. I know that can't be easy to talk about, I'm sure. Have you how often are you asked about it, or do you talk about this topic much, or do you just kind of mostly avoid it and we put you on the spot and you hate us? Or
I am a pretty open guy, for better or for worse. I'm the kind of guy you can ask me about anything and I'll tell you. However, that has been a challenge during this process, and I've had a lot of people angry at me because, as I've mentioned, there's somebody else involved here, and a lot of people have had a very different perspective, specifically her friends, and to some extent her family. They have a different view of what happened, and so it becomes difficult sometimes for me to tell my story in public spaces, because there is another view out there. That's kind of why I started the whole thing, by just sort of with a caveat there. However, it's something that I have written about on Facebook once or twice, and I had a very popular newsletter that I sent out about grief, because a year after my wife left me, my dad died. Not the most fun time in the world, and so I wrote about that process of grief and loss. And then people really resonated with that because they saw my heart in that. But it's a difficult topic to approach, and I have slowly started talking about it more and coming on to shows like this because of a quote I heard once from Brene Brown, which I don't remember the exact quote, but her idea was, talk about those traumatic incidents, talk about that tough stuff only when you've had time to process it. And I feel like now I've had a little bit of a distance where I've processed it. Early on, when we were in the midst of things and I had a lot of anger and sadness inside of me, the things I said online and to other people were not good and kind and what needed to be said. But now I have a little bit of that distance. I processed it, so I feel like I can talk about it in a healthy way.
Yeah. I've been obsessing over the newest Judah and the Lion album and forcing everybody to hear me talk about it, and they hate that. But the one before this, I think he was about to go through or was just going through his divorce. And this one is like really post-process, and he breaks down all the like stages of grief, and it's just so interesting to hear him say, yeah, I'm at fault too. And he admits all this stuff, and it's this whole process of healing in the album. And the one that came out like either right before or during, I think might have been a lot more fun to listen to, where you're like, yeah, angry. And sometimes angry music's just fun. This one's, I feel like I could say, is definitively more beautiful. So I don't know. That's kind of what I'm hearing with your story is I'm like, yeah, right afterwards is and you got to like get that emotion out. And then maybe after you process is when the real God's able to take anything and make it beautiful.
Yeah.
Certainly.
So, this series, What Next, started off as sort of a joke. We are human. We run out of ideas. So, running out of ideas for a show, and we just joke that we'd ask a bunch of guests what the podcast should do next. We've talked to church leaders from a bunch of different traditions and ethnic backgrounds. We've spoken to people all over the world. We've done series on church offices, worship styles, whatever, you name it. It's about a church. We've probably done it at least once. What do you think we should do next? Yeah, we're still in this stage. Surprise.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I like what you're doing now. I think stories are important and powerful, and any way you could kind of talk about that. I think it's important that we talk about the tough stuff because this happens to real world people. You don't expect it to happen to you. I certainly did not expect it to happen to me. And a lot of the really important principles I was learning, I feel like I learned a little bit late. Maybe things would be different if I had known that ahead of time, if I had understood what was going on and had been able to process it. And certainly if I didn't act so angry at the beginning and approached it with a more gentle spirit. So I like the idea of what you're doing, the your what next after whatever, if that's getting those stories and hearing people who have come out of some tough situations. That's always good. I like anything real practical and real, like you can take it home today and do something different with your life. So you guys have talked about a lot of the church offices and the kind of the big level issues. Well, any chance you can do to just make it practical and give somebody something to chew on where their relationship with their spouse in the next 20 minutes can change, or when they go to work tomorrow, it'll be different, their lives, and all that stuff's good. So you'll find something is what I'm saying. You'll find something.
Very encouraging. Yeah.
So this series, and maybe this episode especially, is kind of heavy. And we're going to keep putting that off for as long as we can comfortably. So another thing we're going to do with every guest in the series is to play First Thoughts. We talked about this a little bit. You get access to the first thoughts, so you can cheat. We trust you to not. We hope you didn't. But I'm going to give you a few words, and by a few, I mean 26. Probably not 26. We might stop earlier. But we're probably going to. But all I need you to do is share with us the first thought you have after hearing the word.
Okay.
All right. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Dreidel.
Hanukkah.
Bassett.
Hound.
Correct. Inerrant.
Scripture. Some people think.
Okay. Sue.
Mary Sue.
Marvel.
Marvel.
Mm-hmm.
Movie.
Dragon.
Slayer.
That's a good reference. How many do you want? I'm just kidding. Zoo.
Animals.
Platypus.
Perry.
Panda.
The platypus. Kung Fu Panda.
I like that. Good answer. Disney.
World.
All right, Josh, you wanna pick a few? I lied. Podcast.
The Whole Church Podcast.
All right. That's what we were looking for. That's the answer.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Awesome.
Islam.
Islam. Middle East.
Bible.
Truth.
We would have also accepted Christian Standard. That's fine. Artist.
Music.
What about poetry?
Imagery.
Yeah, that's a hard
Fancy words. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. I'm sure we're going to get to one of these one time and someone's just going to have an entire poem in their head instantly.
Yeah, it's not
and then
me.
someone's just going to read Gilgamesh on our show and we're going to have a 9-hour show.
Sure.
I was prepared with Beowulf, personally.
Yeah,
Oh,
I have
yes.
Beowulf. Do you want me to read Beowulf? No,
Yeah. Oh.
not today.
What's the first word that pops in your head when you hear Beowulf?
Literature. I have read it. It's something.
I like Beowulf. It's a good story. Banana?
Split.
Truly a man of culture. All right. You know what? I think you passed. I think you did a good job. One more, though. Podcast. We did that already.
Yes.
I lied. Animation.
Disney. All comes back.
It's a full circle.
I like that music. That's all. Yeah. That's the end of the show. I just want everyone to know that I enjoyed that specific.
All right. Well, thanks for having me.
No, I think we've put it off long enough. I want to hear a little bit more about the challenges you faced with your divorce, the church spends a lot of time, at least in my experience, building up these expectations for what married life is going to be, what marriage should be. So following your divorce, have you rethought or have you been challenged on any of your beliefs about marriage and the way that it's often taught about?
Yeah, I think in a strange way, and maybe people wouldn't expect this, but I'm almost more conservative on my view of marriage. And I mean, I don't love those labels of conservative versus progressive or whatever, but I think more than ever, I understand the sanctity of marriage, the specialness of it. More than ever, I see how uh, important it is to fight for a marriage. Ultimately, it's not always something where you can save it. I mean, my case being one particular one, um, at least how it's happened thus far in history. And I just think that my beliefs about marriage have definitely been shaped by that experience where um, if I ever do pursue another marriage, I will hold on to it ever more tighter and be more committed to the other person and to bettering myself. Um, I've certainly learned a lot about the importance of working on yourself involved in all of this. Because something that I learned was that, what do you know? You cannot control other people. All you can control is yourself. And that's something I've even taught that to my kids that I teach at school. One of the most important lessons is you only control yourself. If so and so is making a funny face at you, you cannot control that. But you can control if you throw a pencil at them across the room, right? Um, in all those situations, work on yourself. And sometimes other people will change their behavior because of that. Sometimes they won't. But at the end of the day, make yourself better. And so when it comes to some of the church's teachings on that, I think um, rightly so, we talk about one flesh, the one fleshment of marriage and how special it is and how it's two people working together. But it also is still two individuals. We have not grafted each other together and sewed people together. We're still two people with different brain chemistry, different things. So it's just all the more for me realized as powerful as the union is, we also have to be really good on our own. We have to really work on ourselves, and that will help make the pairing all the more better.
Mm-hmm. So, how did your local communities support you or present themselves to you after the split?
Well, I mean, I think a lot of people didn't really want to talk about it. Whether that's because divorce is still awkward, especially in Christian spaces, or because it's so normalized. It's just a thing people do. They get married, they get divorced. Which one of your uncles is on? He's on marriage 5, 6 now. What? Sometimes it can become that. So I think for those two reasons, a lot of people just avoided it, or it wasn't like news to them. And I kind of found an interesting breakdown among my different communities in how they reacted to it. And so this is a generalization. Not everybody fits in this category, but a lot of my more progressive leaning Christian friends were just kind of well, that sucks. Second marriages are better, and things like that, just sort of trying to put a positive spin on everything. And then my more conservative friends tended to not really want to talk about it or be like, oh yeah, that's really tough. And, keep fighting, keep doing what you can. And there wasn't a lot of strong opinions in that area. And then my atheist friends, those that had no faith commitment, I actually found them to be the best community for me because they said, Jake, I am so sorry. That is really tough. That really hurts. And I felt like they were just really there with me in the grief. They didn't have to theologize it. They just were there to deal with the problem I had immediately and were there for me. And so I actually felt like that was surprisingly the most helpful community. Just because they were there for me and they cared. And what a lesson for the rest of the church. And not to say that no Christians ever cared about my feelings or was willing to sit with me in grief, but that really was, I saw the gospel played out more among my non-believing friends. They were the ones that sit there with my grief, like Job's friends in Job before they became problematic. But the first part.
So our next question was, how did people outside of the church treat you? Excellent answer. Thank you. So do you have any advice that you'd like to share for ministers who are listening who are either going through a divorce or considering a divorce or trying to help someone through a divorce?
Yeah, that's interesting. I'm still not a divorce advocate, obviously. I'm not.
Right.
I think at all, I don't want to say at all costs, but I really think we should avoid it as much as we can. And I have said before that I think the sin of divorce is the people that break down the marriage and not actually the signing of the certificate. It's not actually that, because I think a lot of people are in truly bad marriage situations where there's abuse or manipulation or something just real bad going on, where I can see where the out option might be the healthiest, best for everybody. But I want ministers, I want people in the Christian community to understand that we are not the world. We do not need to see out as the first or even the top 5 or 6 best options here. And we can keep fighting for marriage because that is, I think, what God calls us to do. I think some people are really uncomfortable with the idea of Christians would stick out something that's bad for hope the other end. But it's like that's what Christians are. That's like our whole thing. That's our whole identity, is dealing with things that are not ideal for the hope of the ideal world we have on the other side. And everybody needs to pray about that individually, how that applies to their own situation. But I would just encourage everybody to not think of divorce as the first option and to really get help. I am a little hesitant, honestly, to suggest marriage counseling for people that are that far gone. I think marriage counseling is way better when the issues are real minor or when you don't really have any fights and you just need a good checkup. Because one issue that sometimes counseling can happen is it becomes that just a whole experience of just saying how bad the other person is, and the negative things start to compound. Marriage counseling, when it's in crisis, has a 50-50 shot of working, which is about what America's divorce rate is anyway. So it's a flip of the coin whether it will help you or not. Instead, I would really hope everybody's getting that checkup in before things get bad. And ultimately, again, you can only control yourself. So I think it's always great advice to, when you are dealing with people who are in those marital crises, say, well, how can you get better? How can you improve yourself physically, spiritually, emotionally, intellectually? Just get a little better than yesterday. And I think we might see some of that attraction come back.
Mm-hmm. Is there a way that your church could have helped you better through this ordeal?
That is a question that I have thought about a lot. And I will admit I wasn't a fan of how they handled it, but I can't really say how they should have handled it, if that makes sense.
Right.
I don't want a church where it's like, we're going to excommunicate you for wanting to divorce him. I don't want that. But I do wish that some leaders maybe stepped up and tried to speak into that. And some of them, I will say, did. But the other person can say yay or nay to those coffee dates and can choose to listen to that advice or not. And so it's really tough to be in that church situation. But some churches, especially when it comes to divorce, it's almost like the not as bad. It's just so accepted now. We've moved on to other culture wars in America. There's a part of me that wished they had a stance on, we need to try to save this. We're not at such a sickness that we need to cut this off. Which is a metaphor I've used sometimes, is like, if in marriage you are one body, then you have to be really, really cautious about, are you going to cut off your body part? Like, you have to really know, like, you have to, go to the checkup, go to the hospital, and figure out like, okay, is the whatever going to spread, and so I have to cut this off, or is it salvageable? Too often, I think it's like, I have a cut on my pinky, let's cut the arm off. No, that's not the solution there. There are about 25 steps before. And I hope many churches realize that there are steps before that they could come along. Ultimately realizing it's not their decision. Everybody makes their own decisions. But that's kind of what I would say to that. But it's a tough one. It's a really tough one.
I don't know how to word my thought question. So I'm just going to do some word vomits. Yeah. And then just see what you do with it.
Okay.
So what's interesting to me is just thinking through some of the different stages or forms this idea of marriage has taken just throughout time. At one point, biblically, God's people were completely fine with being married to multiple people and then also having eunuchs. And God never explicitly says, yeah, that was bad. And then sometime around the Jesus time, I'm going to call it, you see this more explicit take that the church, God's people, has of no, one man, one wife. That's what it needs to be. And even interesting, if you do some of the cultural studies, is in that time in Rome, really how you got married to a woman, you walked outside in the public, lifted her hand real high and said, this one's mine. It's basically what it was. There wasn't some elaborate ceremony. And that's so a lot of our, let's take marriage seriously, was in this really absurd contrast with let's take marriage seriously compared to the culture is literally going, dibs. That's what marriage was, and then, we go through even in our own country, just thinking of no fault divorce, all these things. And a lot of it, I think, did do a lot of good where women were being abused and terrible situations were happening and people were forced to stay in bad marriages. Last thought before I just throw it to Jake to just address the random things I said. You also have the weird, Catholic, not Catholic, but a lot of high liturgical church rhetoric around where marriage is a sacrament. So it's treated completely differently because for some reason the church let politics get involved with marriage and now you can be legally married. And that's just a weird concept if you think about the fact that marriage is a religious sacrament. Different conversation for a different day. But the Catholic Church just simply won't recognize some divorces. Mm-hmm. And that's going to be true of Orthodox Church and some of the other ones as well. So I feel like there's a lot of complications here that have to do with time, place, manner, religion, that it's just, I don't know, maybe what I'm feeling is that it's really awkward to talk about divorce as if it's just one thing when there's so many different time and places where it means different things.
Yeah, I do think that's interesting, though, that the church can just say, well, we don't recognize that divorce. It's well, we are divorced. So,
yeah. Imagine that awkward
but
situation where TJ still married to Susan according to the Catholic Church, but the law doesn't recognize that one. So he can get married again legally, just not by his own church.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And now we still only get one newsletter and there's two of us. We're separate. Real pain.
Also, how many emails do you think we're going to get about people asking about you being Catholic and also married to someone named Susan?
Yeah, neither of those are true. We're divorced.
Yeah, but that's not. There's no Susan.
There is no Susan. So,
well, that was a lot of word vomit, to use your phrase.
Sorry.
To sort of vomit my own thoughts, I suppose, regarding that, is that I would say that it's very fair that we do have to think critically about sort of the weird culture around marriage that has progressed and changed throughout the years. It's relatively new to marry for love, for instance. And I think that's why we also see things like divorce being more common, because there's this idea that like you have a love tank and you run out of love and it can't be filled back up, kind of thing. But yeah, the quote unquote biblical marriage that some people make fun of because it's like, well, biblical marriage includes multiple wives and concubines and weirdness there. I think we have to look at that critically. Like, well, even if God doesn't say, don't like that, the narratives show us that was usually a mess. By the time we get to the New Testament, certainly the Jews have kind of picked up on, multiple marriages is weird, but they're also copying the Romans because the Romans don't like multiple wives. They would much rather have a system where two people married for legal purposes, but then the man can go off and have as much sex as he wants. The woman can't, though. That's bad. But the man can literally do whatever he wants. So we always have these weird, problematic kind of baggage. We have some baggage to unpack regarding all of that. And although I don't quite go the sacramental way that Catholics have traditionally gone, where they see marriage as a sacrament, and so to break that, they might prevent you from taking communion. That might be one of the practical ways they don't recognize your divorce, kind of thing, right? I don't quite go that far, but there does seem to sort of be something spiritual going on with marriage, and I can't quite put my pin into what that is. But the way the Apostle Paul talks about it, there's something special here. There's something unique about that union of that's sex between two people. There's something unique here, and I want to make sure I treat what is holy as holy and not profane it. So I don't know if that has anything to do with all the things you said, but I wish for sort of a tempered view. Like, we can recognize some weird stuff goes on in the Bible, but what seems consistent is there's something special about marriage.
Yeah. One of the things that's always interested me is how the Song of Songs got canonized, primarily because people mistook it as literature that was poetically talking about Christ and the church, which it's not. But now we're able to look at it and go, no, this was definitely sexual. This is definitely about two people being together. But then maybe looking at Paul and going, but maybe that's still about Jesus. And the fact that one of the best lines in Song of Songs, in my opinion, is he says, our love is like the very flame of Yahweh. And for me, that, again, more word vomit, I guess, makes me go to C.S. Lewis, The Four Loves. I have to quote that at least once an episode. It's a requirement. And where Lewis kind of shows how all of our natural, we're sponsored by The Four Loves by C.S. Lewis. But Lewis shows, though, how like all of our natural loves are really reflecting this divine love, this greater love. And we see all of the faults in our loves, and that points us to the fact that there is a bigger love. And I think part of this thing with marriage is this idea of like, if we're showing God's love in our marriage, that's a big responsibility. And that's something Francis Chan writes about in his marriage book too. And I think it is a huge responsibility, but also seeing that in the weakness and maybe even in divorce, we're able to show, there's still a greater love. And, not that divorce is ever the desired outcome, but I think contextualizing our love basically in light of what it's really reflecting, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. Our Augustine, who I have lots of problems with, but whatever, St. Augustine talks about this idea that like so many things in nature can kind of point us back to God, can kind of show us little microcosms of God's love and things like that. And marriage is one of those. And sometimes we make that the only thing, which cannot be accurate because Jesus and Paul both affirm celibacy and singleness. So it can't be the end all be all. Marriage can't be. But marriage is certainly one of those ways where we see kind of that picture of the divine. We see all that stuff about how God is committed to people no matter what. And we see that commitment, that intimacy that is involved in that. And I mean, that's why God is pictured as the bride of Israel a lot. And then Israel goes off and commits adultery. And then God still takes them back. And there's all that kind of stuff that can be really hard for us to actually live out. And there's no sugarcoating it. That's super hard to do that, to have that level of commitment. But marriage is certainly a way where we can say, hey, one of our values, we got the fruit of the spirits, but we also have this other one we don't talk about, a value of I'm committed to somebody. I want to help you. We love our enemies, even if our enemies don't love us. Like, it's like stuff like that. That's so radical and so Christian, and that could play out in marriage really beautifully.
Yeah. I think, Yeah. I'm just thinking and saying that. I like what you said there.
Okay.
And I guess I want to be careful. I do like this idea that we encourage people to live out God's love and reflect it in your marriage, but also just want people not to mistake that as, hey, we're saying stay in abusive relationships. We're not saying it's completely inexcusable someone's cheating on you to have a divorce. And I don't have like, here's a set rules of when it's okay and when it's not okay for me personally. That's just not something that I live like. I think of God more as this relational, divine entity. So I don't think there's a rules. Here's when you keep it. Here's when you don't. I think of it more as let's do our best. And that might look different case by case, person by person. Mm-hmm. And I just don't want people to mistake it as, hey, stay in your abusive relationship. That's not what we're saying.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I would affirm that 100%. And it is tough. I've had to struggle with these. The scripture doesn't really mince words on this subject. And even in Matthew, the quote unquote exception clause about adultery is even a little bit dicey and is either too strict or too lenient, depending on who you ask, and I do think it is a healthy approach that I've wrestled with myself to have to kind of realize God's grace involved in all of this, because I have gone through this experience and now I have to wrestle with, well, what do I do now? Does scripture allow me to get remarried? What kind of state am I in? Some kind of eternal state of, whatever sin? I don't know. Like, what is it? And it's always good to remember God's grace involved in all of this, whether you're the victim or the perpetrator or the whatever involved in this scenario.
One of my favorite Christian comic strips was just Habakkuk being around when that verse in Matthew was written. And just, what the heck, God?
Oh,
yeah.
Hosea,
right.
yeah.
The prophet Hosea, yeah. My bad. Yeah, they were just really funny, though. Yeah, so you kind of get at, like, what's next? And, like, that's sort of the name of the series. And TJ and I, and actually former guest, I won't say who just because I don't know how public some of this information is. We did know a guy who was a state overseer in a church that we were both a part of, who actually stepped down from his position because the church changed its stance on remarriage. Mm. And it was interesting is he stayed in the church. He's still in a position. He just didn't want to be in a position where he was going to oversee something he disagreed with, which, if you're wondering, that's how you do church unity. That is the perfect example. Support your church. That does not mean you have to carry out things you disagree with. That's another conversation, though. I like what he did, but what you see is in remarriage, in divorce, and whatever, it does seem like that affects your ministry opportunities. Even just as myself, I remember going from a single guy to a married guy. How many more people were willing to be like, oh, hey, do you want to be at my church? Do you want to do this? Ironically, when I was married, I was like, I don't have time for all that. But I guess I'm curious because sometimes it's explicit, sometimes it's implicit. Like people aren't going, oh, you have to be married before I let you speak at my church. But once you are married, you get a lot more invitations, Have you found any change in your personal opportunities that's come up since your divorce, or how has ministry opportunities presented themselves since then?
Yeah, ministry hasn't really been affected as much as I would have expected. And I think maybe it's a little bit in the area of the kind of uncomfortable to talk about thing. I was regularly preaching at a church, a small rural congregation, once or twice a month, just kind of pulpit supply. And, I had preached there as a married person. They had met my wife. And then I had to tell them, like, that's not a thing anymore. And, at first it was a couple weeks of explaining why she wasn't there. But I felt like I had to be honest with the elder in charge there. And then later I told the whole congregation, and like nothing changed. And like, it's like, I don't know if that's good or bad, but everybody was just like, okay, didn't matter, whatever. So I actually found that to be the case. But I imagine that there's definitely a potential that would affect certain opportunities and things. I don't think in the circles that I travel, it is as big of a deal. Like I said, again, for better or for worse, divorce is so stinking normal. And I know in my tradition, the real liberal progressive churches were all the ones where the remarried people could go to church there, because there were churches that'd be like, we don't accept you that you're remarried. And so then they would get the reputation for being super progressive when the only progressive thing they believed in or whatever was just, we're not going to kick you out if you got remarried. You can stay in our church and we'll love you anyway. Real crazy stuff like that. So I don't know. I don't know that it's been as huge of a deal. I know that, in my tradition, in the Church of Christ, there is an interpretation of eldership where elders, the overseers, do have to have a husband of one wife, and that's interpreted different ways by different people. Some people say, well, that means you can't have multiple wives, which is pretty easy for most people in America, unless you're in Utah. But then some people say that means that's ever in the timeline, you have to have one. But I know a lot of churches and even members of my own family that have been divorced and remarried that have become elders. And they have just decided, we're not going to interpret it like that. We're going to interpret that as, the third way to interpret it is, you are faithful to your spouse. And so I don't know. It doesn't seem to be a huge deal. But I actually think the older I get, I will run into the issue of being single and divorced more. I am in a very weird stage because I was married. Legally, I was married 5 years. 4 of those I was with her, and I'm 27 now, and so it's still okay for me to be single because I'm in my 20s and stuff like that. But yeah. I really imagine the older I get, if I don't have a smoking hot wife next to me, that might raise some eyebrows, and there might be different opportunities lost or something because of that. I don't know. We'll see what the future brings.
Yeah. So are there other challenges that we might not have thought to ask that you'd like to talk about on the topic of divorce in the church and how we handle it?
Yeah, I mean, I have struggled and continue to struggle a lot with what Scripture says about my state, because there isn't a lot about remarriage and things like that, but it's now something. It's I don't know. We sometimes think about Scripture applies to those people. I'm not a prostitute, but I can talk about what they're like and where they're going after they die, or I'm not homosexual, and and then it's something like that happens to you. It's now I'm a divorced person, and I would personally like to be remarried. What I can't do? And so it's certainly, we do not have time to go into the details today, and I'm not the person to go into the details anyway, but it's a challenge that Scripture is not positive on remarriage. And in fact, church history up until Martin Luther was not okay with the whole remarriage thing. Some of it would be excommunicated. Others of it would be you can't take sacraments, you can't baptize somebody else, you're not a full member of the church. There'd be different kinds of things like that until Martin Luther got a little bit more acceptable. And then, of course, you got the Anglicans that were hey, we got to have our king. We got to let our king get divorced. So, they're going to be a little bit more tolerable of that. Sorry, Anglicans, that was a oversimplification. But still, I think it's important to at least recognize that divorced people are in a very tough spot in terms of Scripture and church history. And there are some ways to see that, to see the power of God's grace despite all of that, and to even see a, dare I say, development of theology away from that later on. But we at least need to recognize Scripture doesn't seem to want divorced people to ever remarried. It seems to be, it's a kind of one and done thing, unless your spouse dies. That is kind of the exception there. Yeah. Not so fun.
How can we have church unity with people who do kind of have pretty wide differing ideas around if divorce is okay, remarriage, all that kind of stuff? Do you think is that a second tier, third tier, first tier kind of issue in your mind, or?
Yeah, I put that in the second tier. And I define the second tier issues as it might be difficult to worship in a church building with somebody else that believes something very different than you, but we're not going to call it a heresy or something like that. We're not going to call it first tier, but it might still be difficult to have a local community with that. And so I do see that as a potential problem, specifically when it gets into things like leaders and stuff like that. I haven't been booed off the stage for that reason, at least. But, you know, there could be contexts where it's like, yeah, we can't do that. And I obviously never, I never want to say that like I'm faultless in this, but my story is certainly, it was not what I wanted. And I did many steps to avoid it. So that does make me sometimes sympathetic to different ears. But yeah, I think it's a second tier issue, and I think it's tough to sometimes have unity if we can't agree. However, I would love to remind people about God's grace and this really crazy thing that God does, which is take bad situations and makes them beautiful. And you have like the most insane problematic people in biblical history end up doing some good later on, which does not excuse the bad problematic stuff, but God uses people like that. Like, I don't know, there's just so many examples in scripture, specifically in the Old Testament narratives. It's like, yeah, that was not a good guy, or he did something bad. But we see repentance, we see forgiveness, and we see God using people even when their situations are not ideal, even when there is sin present in that life. So I want to encourage everybody, remember that before you quote chapter and verse, before you get into that judgment mindset.
Yeah, remember, there's at least twice where God uses an ass in the Bible. So even if your spouse is being a complete and utter, you know, God could still use them. Yeah.
I'll preach. There you go.
So one thing we do like to do at the end of or before we start wrapping up our episodes, we always like to ask our guests for a practical action, just something tangible our listeners could do right now that might help better engender unity in the church. Jake, what's something practical our listeners could stop and do right now?
In terms of church unity, I think I've had a difficult relationship with prayer in my life, but that was the first thing that came to mind. And the reason I have a difficult relationship with it, because it doesn't seem like a very practical thing to do. But it is sure hard to hate people that you're praying for constantly. And I wonder if we prayed for those that were different than us a lot, if maybe some of our division would melt away. So that's what I'm gonna throw on the table today, and you can deal with that what you will. But pray for those with differences. Pray for their well-being. Not pray. We're not talking imprecatory psalms here. That's not what I mean. Pray for their well-being, and maybe we'll have some more unity.
Yeah.
All right. I think we'll count that. What would change in the world? What are the repercussions if we start praying for the people we hate? What changes? What do we see?
We see ourselves change, and we see opportunities for God to work in the lives that we pray with. I don't necessarily think God is a God of mind control and he's going to take over our enemies and make them believe everything we believe or do all the right things or whatever. But I think prayer is powerful and does kind of poke at the chinks of armor. And so it changes us and it can change others. And we might just find ourselves doing this crazy thing called loving each other. I think is a bit.
Whoa.
Don't quote me on that.
Whoa.
Yeah.
We'll see. We'll see.
Yeah.
Because we're all going to do the action.
Yeah.
We're all going to pray about everyone we can't stand, which is normal. I've been saying that since I was like 7. So before we end the show, but before we wrap up, we like to do our God moment, which you've done before. You know it. If you're new here, I just like to ask everyone where they've seen God recently in their lives, whether that be a moment of worship, a blessing, curse, hopefully not. But I always make Josh go first to give myself and our esteemed guest enough time to think about their God moment. So, Josh, do you have a God moment for us this week?
Yeah. This morning, my work's phone was cursed with call outs. Yeah. And I've never used curse. I wanted to add that to the repertoire of God moments I have. Yeah. But because of that, I had a very challenging morning. And the other, like, 2 people that were at this tour pretty regularly were commenting on how, hey, you're just not freaking out. And it was just one of those, hey, God bless me with peace that surpasses understanding and the ability to see the clock. I knew when I got to leave.
Sort of.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
more or less.
I'm better at that than you. I just leave.
Wow.
Yeah.
What a time. Yeah. Good relatable God moment.
Yeah. I mean, specifically for you. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. For me. Yeah. So I will go next. And for me, my roommate, there are 3 of us. One of them has been in New Mexico for 2 months. He's coming home, and it's great. He's super excited. He hates it over there. Not having a good time. And I just got to talk to him yesterday and had a great talk. Nice to catch up because he's super busy because he's playing football. I'm busy doing other stuff. But
American football or that other football?
American football.
Oh, okay.
Mm-hmm. Indoor American football, actually. So
good.
A little different.
With AC?
Yeah. Yeah, it's still hot in there.
That sounds great.
Yeah, it's still hard to air condition an entire arena, apparently.
Checks out.
But hockey exists. Anyway, Jake, do you have a God moment for us?
Yeah, I've been blessed with many opportunities just to get to hang out with some friends and to really see like Christian community in real life. I recently started going to a new congregation, and it's just been a huge blessing to just get to have really deep conversations with people about things that matter in the world. And it's like, that's just, that gets me going. I'm sure that's, you guys as podcasters understand that, right? Just there's really good conversations. Like this will last me a week. Like I can live off of this high for a while. So I've seen some of that a couple times recently.
Nice.
Yeah, we love that. So if you enjoyed it, please consider sharing with a friend or an enemy. If you hated it, share it with your enemies and your friends, also your cousins.
Yeah, especially those.
Especially the cousins. Consider rating the show. You can rate it on Podchaser, Apple Podcasts, Spotify. Give us a thumbs up, thumbs down, 6 stars. I don't know what anything uses anymore. They keep changing. Thumbs up, thumbs down was a perfect system. That's just my opinion. Percentages are good.
I just can't wait for someone to give us a 1 star on Apple Podcasts. And then the review is just, they don't like your opinions about thumb up, thumb down. Yeah. Our 1 star is just explicitly about your take on rating systems. Yeah. Anyway, check out other shows on the Amazon Ministry Podcast Network. TJ and I are both part of Systematic Ecology. I'm doing Dummy for Theology right now. We're going through logical fallacies. That's a lot of fun. And of course, you can check out Brandon Knight doing My Seminary Life. That's a really fun show. I will have guested on that. I don't know how long ago because I don't know when this comes out. It's not like I produced this. But yeah, we're going to be talking about hermeneutics. So it'll be fun.
We love hermeneutics.
I sure do.
And we hope you enjoyed it. Thank you so much for your time, Jake. Next week, we're going to have Brandon Knight and Will Rose on to discuss what's next after feeling a call into ministry. Then we're going to be discussing Joe Day about what's next after a major split in ministry leadership. And after that, you'll never believe it, Will Rose and You'll Never Believe It to talk about, hold on, what's next with the church after the events of 2020, the pandemic and political violence and those things. And at the end of season 1, Francis Chan, and then what's next?
What is Francis Chan? What's next? Or
no, he's at the end of the season.
Oh, okay.
Then what's next is season 2.
I thought we were just gonna have a Francis Chan after party.
Yeah, if he's down.
A 1 month long podcast.
Yeah, it's up to him.
Yeah.
Thank you for listening to our show. Again, we'd like to remind you that if you would like to help sponsor our efforts to educate and unite the church, you can do so on Apple Podcast, Captivate, or on Patreon. You can also leave a one-time tip on Captivate using the link that's in the show's description.